Hi KRB parents, welcome to the second webinar in the Maximinds Mental Health Care webinar series. We today are focusing on mental illness and understanding the prevalence of disorders, particularly in your children, and I'm looking forward to getting straight into it. Starting with the trigger warning, a reminder that we are talking about mental illness and it does make reference to suicide. If this is a concern to you, please feel free to stop watching the webinar, but also please contact me as I am a psychologist if you would like some extra support. So a reminder of the 8 webinars in the series. We are focusing on mental illness today. So let's get straight into it. Firstly, let's look at the learning outcomes for today. I'm hoping that you will be able to help with your understanding on what is mental illness, what are the most common types of mental illness in teenage girls, what is the impact of mental illness on them, what is stress and how does that differ to anxiety, what are depressive disorders, what are behavioural disorders, and what are eating disorders. And the reason that these particular ones have been chosen to discuss today is because they are the more common ones, and they are also ones that I'm seeing increasingly prevalent amongst my clients, and we can find from the research that these are on the trend, particularly in teenage girls. So what does today look like? As I mentioned, we'll start with some definitions of mental illness, go into the prevalence, why is mental illness important and its impact it has, look at stress and anxiety, depression, ADHD, and then eating disorders. Just to start with, if you please would scan the QR code and answer just one question, that would really help with understanding if and how your knowledge develops throughout the webinar. That would be great, and also to help you reflect on what you hopefully will take away from today. So just one question. If you wouldn't mind doing that, I'll just give you a few more seconds. Thank you for doing that. Now, to start with definitions. What is mental illness? As I have just said before, I'm a psychologist, and we as psychologists are all taught about the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It is an American publication which gives us definitions and helps us with the diagnostics of different types of mental illnesses, which I'll be referring to today to give you some insight into what this looks like. So to start with, this is how they define mental illness. I'll just give you a moment to read that. So a few key things to call out. Clinically significant disturbance. It's to do with cognition, emotion regulation, and behaviour. It can also result in a dysfunction in psychological, biological, and development, and it's associated with distress or disability in occupation, social, and other important activities. And that really is the definition of clinically significant disturbance or distress, which I will go into. What mental illness is not. And again, I'll give you a moment to read that. As you'll see here, it is not just a culturally approved response to a common stressor. It is not just the socially deviant behaviour, although I'll show you how that can be linked to mental illness, and does not necessarily just conflict primarily between what you're expecting your children to do and what they're not doing. And that's, I think, where sometimes the misinformation can come and a lot of labelling happens. So to summarise, from Maximinds' perspective, mental illnesses cause clinically significant distress. That means it interferes with their life functioning. That can be at home, at school, or both. So it stops them, for example, going to school, or it stops them being able to function and do the normal things, the basic things that we would expect them to do. Everything from having a shower to being able to get dressed in the morning or get up out of bed. Mental illnesses are enduring. The point that it's not just a point in time, as you would have read before. It's not just from, for example, a death of a loved one, although that can trigger or unmask mental illnesses. That's not in itself necessitates a mental illness diagnosis. It must be professionally diagnosed. I call this out because there is obviously a lot of Dr. Google, and increasingly amongst your children is TikTok trends and I saw on this that I probably have ADHD or I've got OCD, and this whole a narrative that we're increasingly hearing. And mental illnesses are more than just being, inverted commas, naughty, inappropriate or socially deviant, although this can be indicative of two types of mental illnesses that I'm going to talk about today. So to go back to last week, you will remember hopefully that we define mental health at Maxi Minds in terms of 3 dimensions: having a sense of control, being in the present moment, and being in touch with reality. On the flip side of that then, we also define mental illness as being out of control and in fact being helpless. We also define it not in terms of being in the present, but rather being in the past and the future. And also not in touch with reality, but rather being delusional. To call out a few things here, for example, learned helplessness is the term that we're familiar with as psychologists, which basically means that you learn that doesn't matter what you do, you ultimately have no control or autonomy over what your future might hold or what the impact of your actions may be. That typically leads to things like depression, because when you don't have a sense of autonomy or control, that can lead to lowered self-esteem, which can obviously deteriorate and impact and result in mental illness. Focusing on the past is typically where depression sits. There's that nostalgia and rumination over what's happened and how good it was, versus focusing on the future and that worrying and constantly alert to what could happen is often where we see anxiety sitting. That delusional space is really being out of touch with reality and what's actually going on. Instead, it's more distorted. So this is where more psychosis and things like schizophrenia would sit. Then they're not things we're going to talk about today just because of the prevalence. They're not as common, but that's, I think, really maps onto those there. Just a caveat though, mental illness is not just the absence of mental health. Obviously, that's the simplistic way to help distinguish the two, but just for your benefit, they are both on a dual continuum model of mental health and illness. And ultimately, the optimal, which of course is what we're striving for, is flourishing children, which is having a high mental health, but also low mental illness. As you can see, though, you can still have a high mental health and high mental illness, and vice versa, low mental illness and low mental health, which is not ideal. And most undesirable is, of course, having a mental illness and not having mental health, which is where the floundering sits. So where does mental illness come from? As a reminder from last week, we looked at the nature and nurture debate and how that helps to promote mental health and well-being. Of course, the same principle applies for mental illness, such that mental illness can come on the one hand from nature, so genetic predispositions, if there is a family history, neurobiological factors, particularly abnormalities in brain structure, chemistry and functioning. On the other side, we have the nurture side, which is, of course, when their children's environments are not nurtured, hence the cross, that can lead to mental illness too. So things like trauma, including but not limited to domestic violence, which the research shows has a big impact on children's mental illness, divorce, that can also be a single point in time, such as like a car crash, which could lead to things like post-traumatic stress, and that can manifest as mental illness as well. Could also be things like abuse and neglect growing up from dysfunctional home environments, but also stressful environments at home and or school. So even things that children may pick up around the house, around financial difficulties or extra pressures that are happening with you as parents at work, other challenges with other siblings, etc., can all add to stress and anxiety, and of course, a range of whole mental illnesses. So what are the types of mental illnesses? These are some that may be more familiar to you that you've heard of. The ones that we're talking about today, as I mentioned before, are the ones almost in the corners. So anxiety disorders, ADHD, depression, and conduct disorder as the most common, typically in girls and teenage girls. Other ones that you may be familiar with are, of course, things like bipolar, eating disorders we also talk about because that is an increasing but still statistically small representation of girls, teenage girls with mental illness. There's also things, as I mentioned, like post-traumatic stress disorder, which comes under anxiety disorder, OCD, which is also another form of anxiety, and ASD, autism spectrum disorder. At least one of these would be present in some of the girls at King Koppel, so it's good for your own understanding to know about this, but also to help your children understand what the different types of illnesses are as well, and that's why we give this as a bit of an overview. So in order to categorise those, there's actually types of disorders. Put simplistically, there's emotion disorders, which is where anxiety and depression sit. There's behavioural disorders, which is where ADHD sits, and these other two, which may be less familiar to you, which is conduct disorder and oppositional defiant, and we'll go into what they actually look like. Eating disorders, which are probably more commonly heard of, particularly bulimia and anorexia, but actually the most common eating disorder is binge eating, and we'll go into that and what does that actually look like. So now let's talk about prevalence and how common these types of mental illnesses really are in young girls, and particularly your children. We know that 2 in 5, or 40% of young Australians, experience mental illness each year. So that's 40%, almost half, have a mental illness, and this is based on data from 2022, so just last year. As you can see here, that 2 in 5 is represented in that 16 to 24-year-old category. As you'll find as we go through, there's very limited studies and data done on the younger ages, the 12 to 15, because of things like census and what ABS collects, but I've tried to find as much relevant details to the high school girls at King Koppel to make it as helpful as possible. But the overall trend, as you can see, is, and it's reversed, but as you can see, is that the younger populations obviously have the highest rate of mental illness, but it does decline over time. Unfortunately, however, because of COVID, which is considered a trauma because of the pandemic which happened, when we have traumas, we don't actually tend to see the impact of those traumas for at least 18 months. So there are projected increases for mental illness to increase, particularly in that 16 to 24-year-old, which will be your girls in the coming years, to be more like not 2 in 5, but actually more like 3 in 5. Now, these are projections, obviously, but if we look at the trend it's going, even at, I guess, the best case scenario, it's closer to 1 in 2. So this is why KRB is very passionate about bringing in more information about mental illness so that you are equipped to understand that this is increasing, unfortunately, and how can we do something about it and get on the front foot as early as possible to try and prevent and minimise these sorts of statistics. So as mentioned, we're sort of at 2 in 5 now for young people, and that could be rising. As I mentioned, a lot of the studies that are done on the younger populations from the 12 years old, which is obviously the start of high school, is up on the screen here. What they found, now this is almost 10 years ago, is the rates of anxiety in girls was about 8%. So in every class, you would think there's probably at least a couple of girls with anxiety. Depression was at 6% 10 years ago in girls in high school age. ADHD was 3% and conduct disorder was 2%. Unfortunately, that has risen, as we've seen, virtually threefold. So as you can see, anxiety, this was a study that was released just in February this year by the Black Dog, has found that anxiety is now up to almost 1 in 3 girls suffering from anxiety from the period of 2019 to 2022 on a study of Year 8 Australian students. Depression has risen to 19%, so about 1 in 5, and suicidality is 6%. You'll also see there at the start is distress, which is general psychological distress, which is almost 1 in 2 already. That is distress as opposed to stress is been the downside of it. You can also get eustress, which is the positive side of stress, and I'll show you how that can be also a good thing when you have at least some level of stress, because we do need that to function and to instill action and motivation. So as I mentioned, these figures have tripled in 10 years, which is quite concerning. Based off that same logic, there wasn't data at the time with ADHD and conduct disorder, but using on this particular study, but using the ones from previously, that's sitting then estimated around then 10% for girls, and for conduct disorder 6%. So overall, girls are twice as likely to experience mental illness than boys. This is according to the data. It could also be a good thing, the fact that girls are actually declaring and speaking up more than boys, that they and expressing how they feel, which can be also interpreted as a good thing. And I do think that that's definitely a factor which is helping here to help get the earlier intervention and help girls. So to summarise, as mentioned, the most common mental illnesses in young people are anxiety, depression, ADHD and conduct disorder. This is the 4 that we're definitely covering today, and also eating disorders, which I will go into. It's not far behind, which is sitting around 4%. So why is mental illness important, and why are we even talking about this? Clearly the statistics are already giving you some indication as to the rise that's coming, and it's already quite inflated. It's already happened. Further to that, I think I just wanted to call out a few things to reiterate the importance of mental illness and understanding it in your children. Firstly, a few things that I've heard either verbatim or the sentiment related to. My children has anxiety but should or should not sit the exam. And I think it's something to explore as whether the having anxiety or having some sort of mental illness impacts, and how, and if so, what do we do about that? I would know if something was wrong with my child, they would tell me. Unfortunately, only about 50% we find of 15 to 17-year-olds communicate that they would like help with their feelings and emotions, and the other 50% would deal with the issues on their own. 30% of the younger years, so the year 7, 8, 9, so the 12 to 14-year-olds would deal with the issues on their own, which means that they're actually a little bit more likely to come and seek support. So the numbers, yes, show that they more likely than not, or comparably likely to seek help, but we don't necessarily know that they will definitely come forward. Having a mental illness seems to be trendy at the moment. I think there's a lot of buzz around it, whether it's trendy or not. Unfortunately, it's trending, but that it's sometimes glamorized. The sorts of shows that we're seeing on Netflix and that children are exposed to that almost glamorize things like suicide and make it seem like they're exciting things to have, something that we probably need to probably break the stigma of. Mental illnesses are just a fad, and children and kids should just get on with it and get over it. No child or client that I work with would choose to have a mental illness that I could probably say wholeheartedly. It's not that they're making this up and that they're not trying necessarily to get on with it and get over it. It's something that they have to deal with, just like we have to deal with, say, physical issues. My child is happy and smiley, so I wouldn't assume they have a mental illness. Again, my personal observation, this is not necessary research or stats, but often those that tend to be more smiley on the outside definitely have more inner demons to have. And we can sort of see that in trends with, for example, comedians and the rates of suicide with them. So I think there's some first thoughts in terms of myth busting. Mental illness is a weakness or a character flaw. It's obviously not a reflection of character. The myth that it's not experienced by children, as we've just seen, it definitely is experienced by children, increasingly so, and in fact now more at higher rates, at least reported anyway, of in children, caused by bad parenting. That is obviously not the case. We've seen it's not bad parenting. I think it's a bit of a fixed mindset in the first place, but it's obviously not just caused by, if you want to call that bad parenting, and that because of that nurture dynamic we looked at before. There's obviously also the nature. Other myths, that's not recoverable, it's just a phase and something we shouldn't speak about. It definitely can be managed and treated with the appropriate treatment over time. And the flip side is it's something we should definitely speak about to alleviate not only the stigma, but we do find that obviously communication, open, honest communication, helps to reduce and alleviate symptoms for people and young people. So overall, just want to call out the stigma involves deficits in knowledge, attitudes and behaviours. And that's why we're here really today, is to overcome this with education, empathy. So my job really today is to help teach you about what are these different types, and also to help give you some insight so you can understand from child's perspective what they're feeling, and then obviously give you the education of the strategies to help them. There's many impacts and detrimental outcomes for children with mental illness. In the short term, there's things like emotional, cognitive and social development, difficulties in learning and concentrating, attending to things, and challenges in forming and maintaining those relationships, which, as we talked about last week, are all fundamental things that we need for the building blocks for them to grow and develop and achieve at school. In the long-term perspective, we've got things like delayed emotional maturity and reduced resilience, lower educational attainment and limited opportunities, both during and post-school, and then withdrawal and increased risk of substance abuse or antisocial behaviours. Also didn't call this out before, but another of the in the nurture or the lack thereof environment for promoting mental illness is, of course, the uses of substance, drugs, alcohol, vaping and nicotine, things like that, on extreme can not only exacerbate, unmask it. So further to this, I'll take you through some more specific impacts of mental illness on young people. Firstly, in regards to poor school performance, the average number of absent school days in students with a mental disorder is 24 days, which is equivalent to 5 weeks of school. And this is compared to those without a mental illness disorder of only 11 days, which is only about 2 weeks. Another indicator of mental illness on poor school performance is that they are typically up to 3 years behind in academic years compared to their peers with no mental illness disorder. So further to the impact of mental illness on academic performance, we also have the impact that's on their chronic sleep problems. And this is a two-way street, such that mental illness impacts sleep, but also is impacted by sleep. So a lack of sleep is harmful to the consolidation of positive emotional content. And we also know that sleep problems are a direct impact of mental illness. So it's this reinforcing negative loop here that we have. So really making sure that your children are getting enough sleep is fundamental to their well-being. And likewise, if you're finding that they're not sleeping as well as they have been typically in the past, then that's something to question as to maybe why that is. Unfortunately, suicide and self-harm are ultimately the worst consequences of having mental illness. So, as you may remember from the introductory session, suicide is the biggest killer of young people. Every day, one young person will take their life, averaging about 8 deaths per day. Suicide and self-harm is also the third leading cause of premature death for the general population, so as well as impacting most importantly and greatly are young people, it is also, for your own general knowledge, a huge outcome for the general population. So let's start on looking at stress and anxiety for our first types of mental illness in young people. I'm going to show you the 2 videos. The first one demonstrating what stress looks like in your children, and then the second one regarding anxiety, and then we can talk about how these are both similar and different.
We all get stressed at times, feel concerned, worried, or nervous. Your child might feel tense, easily upset, or even overwhelmed. Stress is quite normal for children and they need a bit of stress to motivate them. But it can cause them to freeze up if they have too much of it. Stress is a milder version of anxiety, involving worrying about day-to-day things. Anxiety is more of a fixation on thoughts or feelings that are repetitive and even catastrophizing. Stress can feel constant and even never-ending, often with physical symptoms like a racing heart, nervousness or nausea, shakiness, and even sweating. The good news is that when stress occurs, you can help your child do many things to stop feeling overwhelmed and stuck. Maxi Minds can teach you these techniques to help you to channel your child's stress into positive and productive action. Anxiety is a scary, often overused, and misunderstood concept. With anxiety, your child might feel worry about the same thing over and over, consuming their life and always feeling on edge. Anxiety has physiological impacts affecting our body. They may feel hot and sweaty, jittery and nervous, have trouble breathing, and a quick heart rate. Anxiety is an extreme form of stress occurring over long periods of time. We all need a normal amount of stress to perform, but too much is when we have anxiety. Anxiety can be managed and dealt with, but must be professionally treated. Maxi Minds offers you the tools, learnings, and treatment to help your child deal with anxiety head on. We can use stress to our advantage. It's all about channeling it in the right way.
So to summarise, as you can see here, I just want to call out the specific graph that differentiates between stress and anxiety. So along the x-axis, we have arousal, which is about energy levels and how much sort of get up and go children have. And then on the y-axis is around performance, so the outcomes and the achievements that are able to be achieved given that level of arousal. So as you can see, the inverted U shows that we do need an optimal amount of arousal to get up and go. A little bit too much of it is sometimes when we have stress, which is for those things like presentations or worrying about schoolwork or upcoming exams and things like that. And that's typically more state-based in a time and place. That compares to anxiety, which is when we have even more arousal to the point that it becomes even more debilitating. And that, I think, is probably a really simplistic way to show the level of arousal in terms of also the physiological symptoms that happen, which tend to be much more prevalent in anxiety. So to summarize the differences, particularly between stress and anxiety, stress in terms of extremities tends to be more mild, whereas anxiety tends to be more severe. The time factor, as mentioned, stress is more situational and state-based, versus anxiety tends to be more enduring and more considered like a trait. Stress also has less of those physiological symptoms or more surface level ones, versus anxiety has more of those and tend to be more debilitating. So hopefully that gives you at least an overview of the differences between the two, although quite similar. So again, back to the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. They define anxiety disorders as any of a group of disorders that have their central organising theme the emotional state of fear, worry, or excessive apprehension. So to just emphasise those three things clearly: fear, they're scared children of something, they worry excessively, and they also have that apprehension to an excessive level. So types of anxiety disorders, you've probably heard at least a little bit about each of these. I'm just going to go through and give you an overview of each of them. Generalized anxiety disorder, as it implies, is more generalized. There's not one specific thing that children are necessarily fearing or worrying about. It could be that they are worried about a certain car color and getting in that and worrying, for example, that they might end up having a car accident for some reason which is disproportionate to the fear. They could also then worry about catching COVID, for example, that might have been heightened. So it's not necessarily specific to an event or a theme or an actual stimuli. Panic disorder, again, as it implies, involves panic, and not just panic attacks in isolation, but disorder implies that they're recurring and they happen over a certain period of time in a certain number. Agoraphobia means the fear of marketplace, which is to do with fear and worrying about being in big crowded places. So it could be really busy train lines, it could be out in public, even at concerts, things like that. Anywhere that's quite busy with lots of people. Quite similarly is social phobia, which is more isolated to social interactions and being in public in a way that's not necessarily crowded, but interacting with other people. Obsessive compulsive disorder gets thrown around a lot, I think, and glamorized, but the two key themes here is obsessive, so it has to be a fixation on something, and compulsive, it has to be those recurring symptoms as well. Separation anxiety, children can get that earlier on as they grow up and start school, things like that. Could also still keep happening in high school with sleepovers and things like that, and worry about being away from you as parents, but also, for example, the home. So it could be feeling separated from something or someone. Post-traumatic stress disorder, we've mentioned that. That can be, as it implies, a stress post a traumatic event. So, for example, if in that example before, there was a car crash they were in and they ended up always fearing the red cars because that was the car that happened. That could be and more extreme symptoms like things like nightmares, night sweats, terrors, reliving that same experience over and over again. That would be more specific, related to a post-trauma. And lastly, not specifically in the DSM as a type of disorder, but this is an increasing type of anxiety that we're witnessing, obviously post-COVID, which is the physical injury fear. So it's really worrying about their own physical health and injury. And that has definitely been exacerbated of late. So has, I would say, OCD, because of that repetitive and very vigilant washing of the hands, keeping distance, all of that got drilled into children, that they absorb that, washing clothes excessively, things like that. So they're the overall types of disorders relating to anxiety. And how does this manifest, and what are the symptoms specifically for your children? So these things, some of them you may be able to spot and see, but we're going to talk in more in depth in terms of warning signs for you next week. The purpose of this is to show you what people experience that have anxiety, and particularly your children. So, for example, they could have recurring intrusive thoughts, as mentioned about that car. That could be continuous. Could be about the excessive washing of the hands and the thoughts that consume them as to why they have to continue washing. Insomnia or have trouble sleeping. As mentioned, sleep is fundamental to the prevention of mental illness generally, but also indicative and potentially of a mental illness disorder and anxiety. Increased worry, we talked about that, worry and the fear factor. Sweating, again related to the sleep, nightmares and bad dreams. Anger, outbursts, irritability, particular moodiness above and beyond what would be expected, for example, in high school students during the puberty years. So beyond just the moodiness. Trembling, and you might see physical shaking. Racing heart, again, you might not be able to see or feel that, but looking and seeing their facial expressions that would go with that. And that's in the absence of physical exercise. Avoidance activities, that's a typical compensating behaviour that children and people with anxiety disorders do. They avoid the thing that's causing them the anxiety, so they will stop going near any red car, for example. Dizziness, again, maybe tricky to see, but if it's not due to some sort of other medical condition, vertigo and things like that, then they constantly report feeling dizzy or in a fog almost. The fog is something that we hear quite a lot also, particularly with anxiety, that induced almost, that's their brain's way of shutting down and just trying to move through whatever it is that's causing them that extreme fear and worry, and getting sweaty without, again, exercise. So there's plenty more features on Maximinds that you'll have access to now for 3 months, where you can take quizzes to start assessing what your symptoms that you're noticing in children might be, watching videos to further go back through and learn again about stress and anxiety, reading articles that will help you to identify but also manage particular strategies, activities you can give them, and also option to refer to a psychologist. I'm just going to start by showing you just a couple of strategies. One particularly, which is very good for the whole grounding exercise, which we talked a lot about, and we keep mentioning this whole thing of being in reality, but it's a particularly good one for anxiety. So I'm going to play that for you now.
You can encourage your children to incorporate sensory engagement activities into their daily routines to support their mental well-being. They can start this by listing 5 things they can touch, 4 things they can see, 3 things they can hear, 2 things they can smell, and 1 thing they can taste. Sensory engagement helps children stay present, enhance their experiences, and promotes their mental well-being. You can encourage your children.
Another activity that you might want to consider for that stress and anxiety is putting those thoughts, and that given it's an emotion disorder, anxiety down on paper and help them get it out of those thought loops that are typical of anxiety, those recurring thought loops as we saw in the video. And they can actually put pen to paper, make things and their feelings more objective, and see things in front of them. Helps with stress and anxiety. This is some format. It's more about getting into the habit and practice of writing down thoughts and helping them to reflect on highlights, lowlights, what makes them look forward to things, etc. So moving on to depression, another common mental illness in young people and girls, as we saw from the statistics at the start. I'm going to play a video for you as to how we define depression and refer to it in terms of feeling down. So I'll give you some insight into that.
Children all feel down sometimes, but they may feel sad or flat for a long period of time. They may start to lose interest in the things they used to enjoy, stop talking to members in the family or being around people in general. They may be feeling miserable, empty, lonely, or worthless, maybe even thinking about death at times. This is called depression, a severe mental illness. They may inherit depression from family, or it may come after a major life event like a death or a separation of parents. You might feel guilty and ask, what have I done for them to be sad about? Am I not a good enough parent? But people with depression can have everything they need, like food and a home, but they start questioning, what's next? Maximinds can help you to find your child's purpose and the motivation to get going. Things will get better, and remember that there's always a light at the end of the tunnel.
So again, we have a definition here from the DSM, and as to how they define depressive disorders. They state it is a negative affective state ranging from unhappiness and discontent to an extreme feeling of sadness, pessimism and despondency that interferes with daily life. So the daily life interference, again, meaning clinically significant distress. So it must interrupt that. To give you an indication of how depression can impact specifically daily functioning, there was a study done, the one we mentioned before, around the difference between those with depressed symptoms and those without, and looked at the impact on schoolwork, joining activities and daily self-care. As you can see, there's at least a threefold increase of impact for those that do have clinically relevant depressed symptoms, which impacts in a negative way on schoolwork and joining activities. As you'll also see, there's even greater of a disparity for the impact of depression on impacting daily self-care. And I think this is one of the key hallmarks of depression, which has the greatest impact on basic things that children need to be doing. For example, having showers, getting up out of bed in the morning, getting dressed, making sure they're having regular eating, exercise. Those that have depression are far more likely to be impacted on that day-to-day basis. So what are the symptoms that children experience if they do have depression? So a lack of energy for no good reason, inability to concentrate, feelings of worthlessness, which is another hallmark of depression, weight loss or gain, so changes generally, sleep pattern disruptions, which we've looked at, feelings of extreme sadness or despair, and the loss of interest or pleasure in activities. So as you can see, quite consistently, key things around sleep, this idea of the energy, not wanting to do anything, not wanting to do what they used to like doing, is coming out quite clear as a theme. So the types of depressive disorders. We have 3 that I pulled out that I wanted to just show you how specifically the DSM defines these and call out some certain things for you to really to look for and just have them on hand. To start with, we'll look at major depressive disorder, and then dysthymia, and then premenstrual dysphoric disorder. And what exactly are all those things? So major depressive disorder, this is the typical one that gets labelled as depression. Key things are that there needs to be 5 of the below symptoms that we'll go through in the same 2-week period and represent a change from previous functioning. They must have at least 1 and or 2, being a depressed mood for most of the day and a diminished interest or pleasure in all or almost all of activities. So that, again, is coming out quite clear. So the things you're looking for is changes to their normal behaviour and mood. In addition to one or both of those, things like weight loss and gain, the sleep interference, hypermotor agitation, which is really restlessness, or they could be the opposite, slow down, and fatigue or loss of energy, worthlessness or excessive feelings of guilt, diminished ability to think or concentrate or be indecisive, and recurring thoughts of death, not just fear of dying. As you can see at the bottom, the clinically significant distress, it must impair their home life functioning, which is those basic things we talked about, which is differences in the way they might not want to get up in the morning. They're either exhausted because they haven't slept, or they just don't want to leave their bed, difficulty showering, doing those basic daily functioning that you can observe, and not attributable to another physiological condition. How does that compare to dysthymia? So dysthymia is similar to major depressive disorder, except that it has less symptoms for the criteria, 2 instead of 5, as you can see under the B criteria, and so therefore arguably less severe, but over a longer period of time, as you can see, for at least 2 years rather than just that minimum 2-week period. So similar symptoms, key things being here is that it's less intense but more enduring, dysthymia. Another common one that I'd pull out for you as parents of teenage girls is, of course, PMS or premenstrual dysphoric disorder, which is actually a mental disorder in the DSM. When it hits these criteria particularly, again, it's got to be severe enough to be at least of these 5 symptoms, and stipulations around, you can look at this closely if you want to, but the final week before the onset, how do they improve, and then it becomes minimal again, and that cycle sort of continues. 1 or more of the following, as you can see, affective lability, irritability or anger, interpersonal conflicts, looking out for that, what happens and how bad they really are in that week before the period with friends, perhaps depressed mood, feelings of hopelessness or self-deprecating thoughts, and or anxiety, tension, and feeling of being on edge. So as you can see, it's almost extreme what we think of as PMS, and it's got to have quite a marked symptoms that look more like what we just read about with depression, dysthymia. 1 or more then of the following also must be present to reach a total of 5 symptoms. So decreased interest, difficulty in concentration, fatigue, again, lack of energy, appetite changes, sleeping changes, and feeling overwhelmed or out of control, and physical symptoms. So another one just to keep in mind, and just attending to seeing how bad that PMS period is, and does it look more like the depressive symptoms that we've just looked at. Some of the devastating outcomes of depression, and they're probably just good to call out so that you're aware of what this can lead to with depression. 1 in 10 will self-harm, 1 in 13 will consider suicide, and 1 in 40 will attempt suicide. And this is not a very nice slide for obvious reasons, but there's the statistics. As you can see, the portion of attempting suicide is low relative to who has it. So it's a smaller chance, but there is still a chance. And so what I do want to give you is some tools around that. So you can absolutely go on to Maximize, and I really encourage you to do that in the next 3 months, is have a look at what the tools you could do to help assess your own understanding of symptoms and things, and whatnot in your children. Learn more, read articles to help yourself identify and manage these sorts of feelings in your children potentially, strategies, activities, and also obviously the option to refer to a psychologist. I will give you now a couple of strategies and an activity, and I'll just play this now.
As parents, you can encourage your children to reflect on their day using the GLAD, SAD, and BIN technique. Have them identify something they're glad or happy about, something that made them sad or disappointed, and something they want to bin, something they want to let go or move on from. This reflective practice helps children focus on the positive aspects of the day, process negative experiences, and cultivate resilience for their mental well-being. As parents,
So that's a good tool to use to reflect each day, and use it almost as a dinner table discussion perhaps. Helps them to go back and think what was actually good in the day and what they can almost put in the bin and move on from. When those more severe things come up, such as self-harm, suicidal ideation, definitely I would refer or suggest you to book in and refer your child to a psychologist if that's ever a concern. In the meantime, this is a safety plan that you could also either do with them or alongside. If those thoughts and feelings were ever being expressed to me in clients and children, this is something that I would get them to do as well, but there's no reason why you can't also work through this with them as an activity, again, for that more those more severe feelings of feeling down, but also if you notice any of those depressed symptoms, this definitely wouldn't hurt, and it'd be a good thing to have as a conversation. Typically when you have a third medium, like a piece of paper, in between you and your child, it's sort of like when you're driving to school maybe with them or being in the car, that conversation's a lot easier because you've got something that you don't quite have to look across at the table at each other. So that's why also, again, having a piece of paper to work through with them can take the pressure off having to look at them in the aisle, for them to look, you in the eye and things like that, to make them feel more comfortable about having these conversations. And it can be used as almost a tool to start that conversation. Moving on to ADHD, another common illness in children. It is one type of behaviour disorder, probably the most well-known, ADHD, and the other ones that I want to just touch on is oppositional defiant disorder and also conduct disorder, because as you would have seen from the start, you're probably thinking, what is this conduct disorder? It is a common disorder, and as you can see from the little character there, it involves aggression, hostility, and extreme feelings of disregard for other people. I'll give you more details about that, but that's these ones we're going to go through. I'm going to start by showing you a video which is covering a new feeling that we're in the process of releasing called I'm Feeling Distracted because of the rise of these sorts of things, these behaviour disorders. So I'll show you this. It is aimed still for students, but the parent one is coming.
Feeling distracted can pose a significant challenge for anyone, hindering their daily life. Distractions can manifest as difficulties in both focusing attention or experiencing hyperactivity and impulsiveness, or even a combination of both. If you find yourself more inattentive, you might notice tendencies to daydream, procrastinate, or being forgetful. On the other hand, if you lean towards hyperactivity or impulsiveness, you may find yourself fidgeting, feeling restless, or engaging in excessive talking. It's important to acknowledge that many people encounter these challenges, but for some, these distractions can significantly impact their daily lives and consume a considerable portion of their day. You might wonder why you struggle to focus, unlike your friends or other kids. The good news is that Maximinds can provide you with tools and valuable tips to effectively manage distractions, raise self-awareness about your actions, and enhance your ability to concentrate when necessary.
So, distraction, which is the word we're using to make it more accessible for children, is really aimed at helping students and children with ADHD. So ADHD affects the brain's executive functioning, the ability to self-regulate and control thoughts, words, actions, and emotions. So really on that self-regulation and control piece. As you would have seen, there's two subtypes within ADHD: inattention and/or hyperactivity and impulsivity. In the inattention, it was those things like daydreaming, procrastinating, forgetfulness. So they're not attending. They're unable to stay on task. They seem not to listen and have more trouble concentrating and focusing. Hyperactivity, of course, on the other side is as it implies, being hyperactive. The more classic symptoms we think of in ADHD, the fidgeting, restlessness, excessive talking, overactivity, inability to stay seated, intruding on other people, blurting out answers, that sort of type. So they can have both. They can have one or they can have both, just making that clear. So even though it's called ADHD, with the H on hyperactive, it's misleading. You can have ADHD without hyperactivity. You can just have the inattention subtype. And that's probably just good to know. There's criteria, and I'll show you that in a second, as to how we differentiate. In terms of diagnosis with ADHD, it is diagnosed in males at least twice the rate that it's diagnosed in females. This is not necessarily because more boys have ADHD, I don't think, and the research would suggest it's a result of a couple of things. One being that women tend to, the theory is that they tend to regulate themselves more and adapt and learn their behaviours and model what's the acceptable behaviours, rather than going off and being fidgety or making outbursts or being off with the pixies in inverted commas. So they learn more how to regulate those sorts of things, and therefore it's more apparent and easy to identify in boys. The theory is that boys display more of those obvious symptoms, as I just mentioned, the fidgeting, the outbursts, the disruptive behaviours. We're now finding that girls show different sorts of symptoms, more the overly talkativeness or the emotional reactivity, things like that. So the gender balance, I suspect, over time will continue to change. We did also find that the diagnosis was 7 years old previously, and as mentioned, is now getting older. because I think we're broadening the definition of ADHD and helping to identify those classic symptoms in women that they've been helping to mask and cover up for a while. So always good to get a diagnosis and help identify what might be causing the inattentiveness or the off with the pixies or forgetting the textbooks and things at school in your children potentially, and that's just something to consider. This is the diagnostic tool that we use at Maximinds, and we do give it to themselves, the parent and the teacher to get an integrated approach. And some of you have completed this. So I think that's what it really does, is differentiates between those two inattentive and hyperactive subtypes that I mentioned. And then we can score that and use that as one or independently 3 parts of information, in addition to assessing the child over time and seeing whether they do have those ADHD tendencies. I also mentioned the other 2 behaviour disorders in addition to ADHD. Conduct disorder I covered a little bit, but to differentiate, oppositional defiant disorder is diagnosable when children are younger, so typically more junior school. This is very simplified, but typically before 12, and then for conduct disorder, it's typically when they're older. The difference between the patterns then, of course, because children would be doing and be exposed to different environments when they're younger. So theirs is more, for oppositional defiant, is repetitive pattern of defiant, disobedient, hostile behaviour. So they might be irritable, argumentative, defiant, vindictive. On the flip side, conduct disorder is more of that extreme, which sometimes can develop out of ODD when they grow up, which is serious violations of basic rules of others' social norms and rights. So more aggressive and violent behaviour, deceitful and disrespectful. As I mentioned, conduct disorder is among the top mental illnesses that are diagnosed, even in girls, even though it's less so. It is still a very heavily diagnosed mental illness and something to keep in mind. I don't anticipate that there'd be many girls at Kincoppal with conduct disorder, but I'm sure there are a few. So if it's not quite sure if it's beyond that naughtiness and socially deviant behaviour that we were talking about before, then this could be something to consider. How to manage and treat behaviour disorders. This is a few of the tools and techniques that we're starting to develop in strategies. We will cover this also in the prevention webinar later on, but to give you an overview, setting expectations, removing all distractions, even the clicking of a clock can disrupt someone with ADHD. Frequent feedback, those shorter interval times, rewards, breaks, more regular breaks, flexible rules, not overloading them, and obviously encouraging support. I will give you just a couple more strategies we've already got. These are available on the website now, so I'll show you these for now.
As parents, you can emphasize the significance of routines in maintaining mental well-being. Ask them to take a moment to write down the daily tasks they need to complete. It could be as simple as eating meals at regular times, exercising, or making their bed. Then ask them to consider their weekly tasks. These are things like chores, such as cleaning their room or walking the dog. Finally, ask them to think about what they need to do on a monthly basis. These can contribute to the overall mental well-being, such as engaging in a hobby or planning something special. Organising tasks in different time frames helps them feel more in control and gives structure to their lives. By following a routine, it establishes healthy habits, reduces stress, and creates a sense of stability and productivity, which are all crucial for maintaining their mental well-being.
So, another great task for children with behaviour disorders and particularly ADHD is something like this, bite sized tasks. So, giving this to them and asking them to break their overwhelming list of tasks into one big task, three medium tasks, and then five small tasks. And it doesn't really matter about how you structure this and whether it's in those chunks, but this is a good way to help them to structure a big, overwhelming thing that they've got to tackle and break it up into more manageable bite sized tasks. As mentioned, we do have coming soon more resources on Distracted, so we'll let you know when they are available. That will help with things like ADHD and ODD and conduct disorder. So stay tuned, they're coming soon. And last but not least, eating disorders. We're probably very familiar with them given the way they are publicised and glamorised potentially in some ways. But how do we actually define eating disorders? The DSM says it is any disorder characterised primarily by pathological disturbance of attitudes and behaviours related to food. So what do the symptoms look like? Again, pathological disturbance, struggles with eating in front of others. Your children might have obsessive thoughts about food, weight, or eating. They might develop rigid rituals or rules around eating, and also purging. So this is quite common in terms of disordered eating at a high level, as you can see. Almost a third of Australian adolescents currently engage in some sort of disordered eating. That does not mean necessarily that they have the second component, which is actually have an eating disorder, which is sitting between 4 and 9%. 4% because in any one year. This is the general population. As mentioned before, finding statistics on younger populations, particularly from 12 to 15, is trickier, but as a general rule, 4% currently have an eating disorder and 9% will have in the lifetime will have an eating disorder. It is they are twice as common in girls as boys, and that is probably not surprising given the concerns which tend to relate regarding body image and things like that to girls, particularly your children as they go through puberty in high school, tricky age and stage, and this is why these sorts of eating disorder challenges come up. Also things like social media and that constant comparison, which, as we've mentioned before, distorts their sense of reality, which can exacerbate mental illness. So the types of eating disorders. Despite bulimia and anorexia being the most commonly heard about, binge eating disorder is the most common type of eating disorder. With those that have an eating disorder, 48%, so almost half of those, have binge eating disorder. 12% of those with an eating disorder have bulimia, and 3% of those with an eating disorder have anorexia. So what does this look like? Again, DSM, here's the criteria for you. Binge eating is characterised by both eating in a discrete period of time, an amount of food which is considerably larger than most people would normally eat in a normal period of time. Also a sense of lack of control over eating. So that lack of control, it's probably sounding familiar to you by now, a big component we think of mental illness. Binge eating episodes are associated also with 3 or more of the following. So more rapidly eating beyond full, eating when not feeling actually hungry, eating alone, feeling disgusted with oneself, depressed or guilty, and that marked distress is present, and the eating must happen on average at least once a week for 3 months in order to classify as this binge eating disorder. Bulimia. Bulimia is a recurrent episode of binge eating. So eating in a discrete period of time, definitely larger than what most individuals would eat in a similar period of time. a sense of lack of control again. With this, on the other hand, there's also compensating behaviours in order to prevent the weight gain. So that might be the vomiting, laxatives, diuretics, other medications, fasting, excessive exercise. And this has to happen on average at least once a week for 3 months. Regarding anorexia, it's a restriction of energy intake, and weight is less than minimally normal. Has to have an intense fear of gaining weight or becoming fat, and a disturbance in the way in which one's body weight or shape is experienced. The key things for you to look for: changes in weight, diet, exercise, and appearance. The first three are probably more obvious given we're talking about eating, and they are very common symptoms that we would expect to find. It is also tricky that you obviously spend, I assume, a lot of time with your children, and looking for changes is very hard day to day. So it's probably a good idea to step back and think every couple of months, and maybe even every quarter, notice, is there any changes in this? So it might be things like deciding to eat out more, but actually then not going and eating with friends, or it might be doing a huge amount of exercise, taking up running and getting quite fixated with it and doing it over and over and in quite repetitive. With the appearance, as I mentioned just before, social media has obviously exacerbated this fixation tendency for young people, particularly girls, to make constant comparisons about themselves, their body image, their facial features, etc., to other of their peers. This is obviously increasing the rate of mental illness and distorting their sense of reality. And that's one of the biggest problems that we think are Maximinds around the problems with social media, is because of that disparity it creates between what's realistic and what's distorted, which was, as we define it, as one of the key factors of mental illness. I've written makeup because I think personally, from my own experience with working with young girls with eating disorders, that is a clear marker for me. If they start putting on a huge amount of makeup, really heavy eye makeup, that there's something else going on. And this could be just generalizing, but that's my example of teenage girls that gives me an indication that they're changing in some way. This may not necessarily mean that there's an eating disorder going on, but I think those sorts of things, and they can be definitely very normal, as mentioned, as part of growing up, puberty, interest in romantic relationships and things like that. So not to say that's definitely an indicator, but that's something that I've picked up as something to look out for. So why do we have eating disorders? These are a list of things and traits that, again, I've noticed and we've noticed over the years with working with young people. So things like perfectionism, tendencies to like things just so in a perfect way, fixating and obsessing over that, can tend to be diverted then into things they can control, which is eating. And that goes to the second point about feeling out of control. So therefore, something they can control is their eating. So that's just that fixation with portion sizes, watching sort of what you're getting a bit more interested in what you're cooking. Of course, that can be a natural interest that they're developing in cooking, but just there's sorts of things to keep an eye out for. Why can also be comorbid, which means it's can occur simultaneously with or a product of anxiety. There has been studies to suggest that social anxiety particularly can be a precursor for eating disorders, and that perfectionism I just spoke about and those OCD tendencies to be quite obsessive can also be linked to eating disorders. Another reason is, of course, because of that focus and fixation on image, body image, appearance, is an underlying self-consciousness, which is compared to one, their peers, but then two, and much more severely, because it's out of proportion and our reality, are those on social media. So self-conscious plummets. And for teenage girls, I have I would say almost every client I've got has some form at some stage that's a female adolescent, some form of self-consciousness challenge, which they are either associated with whatever else is going on, but it seems to be just an underlying thing that happened in teenage girls, which is why it's so relevant here, and I think it particularly leads to things like eating disorders. So I'm going to show you a video around self-consciousness and how that can help to give you some insight.
Self-consciousness is about feeling embarrassed, ashamed, stupid, or judged. It involves a lot of guessing about ourselves, about how others see us, and why we feel the need to please others first. Your child may start to doubt themselves and question their sense of self, which can limit their ability to achieve their full potential. They constantly look for validation from others. Their confidence drops because they make assumptions which only exist in their minds. This can be normal, especially among young people who are finding their way in the world. Maxi-Minds can give your child the skills to show them how to please and validate themselves, to ultimately build their sense of self, self-esteem, and self-confidence. Parents can foster a positive home environment by promoting self-compassion and self-love. You can explain to them the concept of a heart hug. Encourage them to place their hands on their heart as a physical reminder to be kind to themselves. Teach them to offer themselves words of love and understanding. By cultivating self-compassion, children can improve their self-esteem, reduce self-criticism, and enhance their mental well-being. Parents can foster a positive...
So there you've seen a little bit more about self-consciousness, and one particular strategy that I love working with girls to do, because girls do tend to need more confidence, is those heart hugs. And you will get pushback to start with, but encourage them to give themselves those heart hugs, show them how to do it, give them heart hugs, because girls don't give themselves enough validation. And I think that is an underlying root cause of things like eating disorders, but also other mental illnesses, stress, anxiety, things like that, depression, can often be underpinned by self-consciousness. So that's a key feeling that we have online, and really encourage you to do that with your children. Things I love about me, another thing that you might get some resistance with to start, but get them to write down a list of things that they love about them. So not things necessarily that you think you love about them, or that friends do, or that even that teachers might compliment them on, but get them to really think about for themselves, because as you saw in the video, it's about getting validation, internal validation. When we have that, and when girls have that, external forces, which naturally are beyond our control, beyond their control, they can't have them to be consistent. If they've got their own internal sense of self, that really helps as a fundamental underlying factor in promoting mental health and well-being. So these are tools that I would use. They can feel phony and cheesy, but I can't stress the importance of the confidence building in teenage girls. Sort of like last week, my most important takeaway was around, if you did nothing else, it's the mindfulness meditation as a general principle for teenage girls. Building confidence with little strategies like this, I think is key. So hopefully that's clear enough. To summarise, mental illness, hopefully you've taken away, affects 40% of young people, and it's expected to reach 60%. There are many types of mental illness disorders. We've looked at emotion today, including anxiety and depression, behavioural, ADHD and conduct disorder, and eating disorders, including binge eating, bulimia, and anorexia. Most common in girls is anxiety, depression, ADHD, and conduct disorders, and eating disorders are increasingly prevalent amongst young girls. So they're the facts of hopefully what you've taken away today. I would love if you could answer again a couple of quick questions, also just to reflect on how you think your knowledge has developed, hopefully, throughout this webinar. And if you have any further feedback for things you would like to hear more about going forward relating to mental illness or future topics or otherwise, there's a spot for you to put in that as feedback, which is all anonymous. So I'll just give you a couple of seconds to do that. Thank you. Finally, resources. Emergency contacts, always good to have on hand. There they are again for you. Maximinds is available for you for 24/7 access for the next 3 months for free. So please make use of all the tools and strategies, some that you will find that we've gone through today, but there's plenty more online, differentiated, as I mentioned, by different feelings and emotions. And there you can also have the option to book a psychologist. But of course, you've also got your KRB counselling team as well. So to close, here are my contact details for any further questions, comments, feedback. Thank you very much for attending the second webinar, and I will see you next week for warning signs. Thank you.